One of the criticisms about modern comics that I see a lot is that the art style has changed in order to make women, well, unappealing. That the art style has, decurved. I'm not sure that's a word. Anyway, it's made the women look typically more. I mean, just a point of view, more ugly, more masculine. With a lot of people believing there's an intentional plot or mission to actually, punish men for liking the female form. Is this true? Well, that's a hard one to kind of, gauge. But I think the bigger surprise I have is the reaction that often comes to those criticisms. Like those people are crazy. What are they talking about? It's one of those topics that, of course, has a lot to do with how you view comics. But there's also some definitive stuff in there too. Let's talk about it. See if we can figure it out. Hey everybody, this is Perch. I think just being able to get through this video in with my sanity intact in one piece is going to be a bit of a challenge, but let's see if we can do it. I think that this is one of those cases where I feel like a lot of people are not in denial is the wrong word, but there's a lot of disingenuous arguments, I think is the best way to put it. And the way this often goes is that people will, criticize current art. And one of the common things, if you just look at the common critique, one of the most common ones is that women are intentionally drawn ugly or masculine or not like women or, whatever it might be. And the response to the opposite, I like to look at the arguments. The response at first is, what are you talking about? Nothing has changed, which is not true. I mean, if you look at comics and frankly, if you look at the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts, the teens, you can see changing art styles. To say that nothing has changed is not true. There's always been changes in art, and sometimes that changes, more lines, less lines, more. It just all kinds of different things. There's definitely art styles that change over time, and we're in one now. But it's also true that the female form, the female superheroes, is drawn in a whatever phrase you want to use here, less sexual, less curvy, less supermodel like. I mean, pick your term, and I think run with it. You can't deny if you hold up kind of any X title in the 90s. I mean, any Marvel book for that matter, but certainly any X book, and you say, look at Rogue here, or Psylocke, or any of these characters, and then you fast forward to today, there's definitely, a different way both the characters are costumed and the way the characters are drawn. Things have changed. Now, that's a kind of an undeniable fact. What isn't a fact and what is in the realm of opinion is if this is a good thing or not. For some, this is a more realistic female form. It's a non-sexualized female form. It's one where I guess more achievable or realistic. I always get hung up on the achievable part of the argument. People are like, well, now this female form is achievable. It's like, yeah, but you're applying it to like Storm, who's flying around in the clouds with lightning powers. I mean, I think you made her body type more realistic, I guess, but she's still flying around throwing lightning. So I mean, I'm not sure realism is the ground to stand on here. I just, I've always been troubled by that argument. And by the way, it goes for men too. I've heard it's very rarely though. Very rarely do people go in and say, the male figure in comics is unrealistic. With constant abs and super muscles and all the rest. You don't hear a lot of. I guess I've missed the blogs and the websites devoted to men complaining about the male form, and we can all go into why that is, which I'll get to some of that in a minute. But anyway, it's made for women, and things have changed. But the realistic argument, I always like. Okay, I mean, I could definitely in the '90s, back when Sue Storm had the underwear boob window costume, when and granted, I think Jim Lee, Mark Celestio's guys, amazing artists, But there was a period of time where, like, it was the X-Men, which included Rogue and Gambit and and Cyclops and Psylocke's ass and Psylocke. It was like there were two separate things. Like you had her ass and actually the character as almost two separate characters in the X Men, and it was fine. It looked nice. I mean, I'm not going to deny that it didn't look good. It looked good. Uh, but I think that another the common one that comes up a lot now is She-Hulk. So She-Hulk was drawn in some say cheesecake. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. In the Byrne run, she was definitely shapely. She'd get herself into wacky situations where she didn't have all of her clothes, and that was kind of the nature of that book. And today, She-Hulk is more like the Hulk She-Hulk. It's more muscular, more rage based. I guess is kind of her character. And there are some people who like it. There's some people I think who legitimately say, "Hey, these changes are good. I think the character is better for me now. It's more realistic. Whatever it happens to be, I think it's an improvement." And then there's others that hate it, that think it's terrible. Um, for me, it's a little bit. Just in my own personal opinion, it's a little bit of a tricky thing to go into because I think simultaneously, the art in general for comics, and this is where I think the two topics often get confused up together. The art in general for comics is not as good as it used to be, and I mean they're paying less for one thing. I mean that's they're paying for less talented art. They're churning out more books faster, so there seems to be less time. We've had the penciler and the inker have been combined into one, which I think has had a negative impact in comics. And I think all those things. So when I look at a book, it's like, well, yeah, I grant you the women are drawn um, less feminine now, but the whole book is drawn poorer for me. For my taste, the book in general. I mean, like the table is worse. The men are worse. The women are worse. Cars, the random things in the background. Everything seems a bit worse. So I often think, do I want to make are we making the argument that the women are not drawn as good, or that the art is bad? And I think you could just go the art is bad and pretty much cover it. The argument that a lot of people make is that this is an intentional editorial decision to avert the male gaze, or to kind of punish men for what they like. And I will say I do think there's an argument to be made that I think there's been editorial mandates, or there's been kind of decisions made at publishers to desexualize the characters. And I think in some cases they shot past maybe the goal they were going for, and they went too far. I think, again, some people may like it. This is all personal taste. But back in the 90s, the costume change for Sue Storm, for the Invisible Woman, looked terrible. It was just a terrible costume. You remember Polaris, when she got her costume change in X Factor? It was an awful costume. I mean, was designed poorly. It was all kind of belts, pouches, and butt, and it didn't look good. To me, it did. I didn't care for it. Now that said, you got the issues where Jim Lee's got Rogue prancing around in Savage Land, or those are all torn up. I mean, those look good. It's a good looking book. I'm not gonna. I'm just saying. So where do things? There's definitely been, I think, a desire to move past those kind of 90s stereotype female costumes. And so I think some changes were made, and I think some of those changes were probably good, and then I think they kept going, and you got to, I mean, again, I'm going to go almost back to the same thing. A lot of the costume designs are just blah. It's like when Kelly Thompson did the costume redesign in CBR, and the female characters kind of all got these kind of baggy clothes and jackets, and it took away any uniqueness from the costume. And I think you can still achieve kind of sexy and unique without setting it on horror. I think you can you can make that all work. Um, Again, this whole topic is around personal preference. I don't think, and this is just me, and I know some people disagree, that I don't think that Sana Amanat wrote a memo to the people at Marvel and said, hey, from now on, we're going to make the women unattractive and screw those men because the future is female and screw the men. I don't think that occurred. But what I do think is the message got out saying, hey, tone down on the sexuality. We need the costumes to look more realistic. We need more realistic body types. We don't need giant boobs flying around in the sky. And I think the interpretation of that, the art and kind of the quality, came alongside cheapening of rates and a lot of misunderstanding of what the rules actually were. And so to play it safe, you got this kind of homogenized, just dopey art. I think that is what happened. I don't know. That's my conclusion anyway. The thing about art in general and this argument, because now I'll hop to the other side. There's this group that says you can't have sexy art because it's like gross men or it demeans women and gross men are going to do weird things with it. And here's what I have a hard time. I have a hard time believing that there's men who are going to like they're walking around and they're super horny and they really want women but they can't get them and they want to kind of you know release their pent up patriarchal desires, and so they go and they buy a comic book and they flip to page, they flip past the opening and the credits, and then like 5 pages of like Venom running around or whatever he's doing, and then they get to like page 7, and there's like 2 pages where Spider Gwen shows up and she's got a skin tight costume, and then guys just you know furiously whatever to that page. I mean, let's see. Do I care about demonetization? I don't really care, but I don't want to gross people out either. People are driving, eating their lunch, listening to this. I just don't think that's happening. I think that it's kind of the same thing as a topic around racism. I think that if you're some sick weirdo, I don't think comics is going to be your go-to place. Even if comics were drawn completely like they were in the 90s, I just don't think so. I also don't think there's a bunch of like young men, like 14, 15, who are getting X-Men and going, this is the template for how I'm going to view women. I don't believe it has that kind of influence. I don't think it ever did, but I'm really confident it does now. That it does not, I should say. I think Fortnite has way more influence over people's kind of view on body types and everything else than comics. And I say that because the sales of comics just don't indicate it has that kind of reach. So if you're a creator in comics and you're, working away tirelessly to try and make the world a better place, I think you're best off doing it by trying to create a good mass market product that appeals to a big, wide audience of people. I think the idea that you're going to kind of social engineer through comics is just kind of absurd. It's like if I thought that my channel here was going to somehow cure cancer, it's like it's not going to do that. I can talk about cancer every single day for the next 5 years, and it's not going to have an impact. It's just wrong place, wrong time. So that's how I look at this. So anyway, I think people need one. I think people should just like what they like, and not feel embarrassed or ashamed about it. I like the way Jim Lee drew women back in the 90s. I admit it; it looked great. I'm not embarrassed about it. I think it's cool. I think he made some pretty looking girls on the page. At the same time, I think Michael Mignola also made some really attractive art that included women. And I don't think you look at Michael Mignola's art and go, "Yeah, here's a guy who's writing, doing exploitive cheesecake illustrations of women." I don't think so. I think there's some modern artists who draw, female characters in different ways, and it looks fine. I think there's plenty that do, and I think there's other artists that draw terrible looking renditions of characters. I don't like the new She-Hulk design. I mainly don't like it because it's just like it's the Hulk, but with long hair. I think what makes comics often great is their uniqueness. I think when they lean into the uniqueness and they give readers something really kind of special and different to look at, I think it's cool. I don't want them changing all the characters into looking the same. By the way, I think a good example, because when I argue with people about this, they often point to like the gross 90s. One thing that the 90s did is the costuming, the buckles, pouches, shoulder pads of all the costumes in the 90s got really tiring. I mean, like super, super tiring. It's like everybody had the same costume. It didn't look good. There was this kind of extreme art style, partially used by extreme studios, that started to make just everything look the same. And it's like I thought that looked terrible. I don't want everything to look the same. I mentioned earlier, I like Jim Lee's art. I like how he draws women. I don't want all the artists to draw like Jim Lee. That would be terrible. I don't want every comic book to be a Jim Lee looking comic book. I like my variety. I like things to look different. And so that's how I view this issue. I think that in many cases we've swung from kind of silly renditions in the 90s, goofy costumes and everything else, to a overly conservative, weirdly baggy nonsense art style now. I think that there's too much of the same type of art today that hits on what I've been talking about, just like there's too much of that same type of art in the 90s. I think comics is a small business, and I think that you definitely have a lot of timidness, I think, in the arts, and I think the creators will sometimes pull their punches. They won't draw the super sexy looking woman because they're afraid that they're going to get called out on Twitter, and then the editor's going to be mad. They're not going to get more work. I definitely think that's true. I think that so I think everybody plays it ultra conservative and safe, and in many cases, blah. For me, I want to see dynamic art. If whether the women are drawn, with huge curves or no curves, I want the art to be top tier, looking really good, and that's what I go for. But that's me, and this is a personal opinion. Everybody's going to be a little different in terms of what they're after, and that's okay. That's what counts. Anyway, what about you? What do you like? Do you think there has been like a concerted plot over the last 10 years or so? Do you think it's just, and how wrapped up do you think it sits with just art in general being of a poorer quality? Leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, follow me on social media, and thanks for listening.